So yeah, so this is on the British parliamentary format. Uh, as I said, as I mentioned yesterday, this is the format that's most commonly used on the university level, and it's the most commonly used format in the UK where I study. So it's a really good format to get involved with, considering things like the World University Debating Championships are held in British parliamentary format. So the basic format that we're dealing with here is that most importantly, there are four teams involved, unlike most like debates which you might be used to, where there would only be two teams. So you might expect that there's one team going for the motion and then one team against the motion. That's not the case here. You have two teams on either side. So, for example, on the motion we did yesterday on this house would implement a sugar tax, and I'll be using that as an example throughout the lecture today. You're going to have the opening government team and the closing government team both saying that a sugar tax is a good thing. And then you'll have two other teams, opening opposition and closing opposition, both saying that a sugar tax is a bad thing. And another thing to note is that since you are in a team with against three other teams, despite there being a like closing team, for example, which is on the same side of the motion as you are. So you might both be saying that a sugar tax is a good thing. You're still battling against each other. So you want to do better than this other team. You want to win over them and show why the contributions you made are more important. So second most important thing, each team has two speakers. So you're with a partner. And so in total, a debate has eight people being involved in it. Okay. Uh, then next thing to note is that technically speaking, you're allowed 15 minutes of prep time, followed by each person giving a 5-minute speech. So 8 sets of 5-minute speeches. In the context of our summer camp, we're going to be much more lax on these rules. So we're probably going to have minimum prep time of around 20 minutes, and it could easily go over time as well, considering how like people are prepping, if it's going well or not. And realistically, a 5-minute speech is actually quite a long time to be speaking for by yourself. And so it's completely fine. Do not worry at all. If you give a 1-minute speech, that's fine. 2 minutes, fine. It doesn't matter. Of course, aim for more. Try getting to 3 minutes if you can, and the more the merrier, really. Of course, 5 minutes is the optimal amount, but I don't expect anyone to necessarily be going that far. Last thing to note is if you do if you are able to speak for a really long amount of time, then 5 minutes, 15 seconds is the upper bound on how long you're allowed to speak for. So the judge is not allowed to continue listening to what you have to say or give credit to anything you say after 5 minutes and 15 seconds. So usually in these debates, the speaker is timing themselves so that they know how much time they have left in their speech, if they should move on to their next argument, things like that, because time management is very important. So you want to be able to fit everything into the time you have, and the judge is also going to be timing you to make sure you don't run over time. Okay, I hope that's clear to everyone. If anyone has any questions, please just speak out. I can't actually see if you raise your hand or anything, so just like unmute and speak. Okay? Thank you. Okay. Um, so yeah, that's the basic format. Now, moving on to, sorry. So moving on to your speech. So a individual speech lasts for 5 minutes approximately on a like a professional level at least, and it consists of three main sections, you could say. First is the introduction, where you do something called signposting. That's like a debating term, which I'll explain in more detail, and you introduce your main points. So what this looks like is basically you summarize what's going to come up in the next 4.5 minutes of your speech. And I guess it's similar to what you might do in certain types of essays when you're like doing written pieces of work. Quite often in your introduction, you're kind of going to lay out the headlines of the rest of your paragraphs, things along those lines. It's to make sure the reader, or in this case, the judge, has a good idea of what they should expect from your speech. They know the overall structure of your speech, they know the overall case you're trying to make, what kinds of arguments are going to come out in your speech, things along those lines. So once again, to give an example, since I think that's quite useful in these kinds of scenarios, for the motion of this House would impose a sugar tax, in your introduction, when you're signposting, you might say something along the lines of, panel, I'm going to be giving two main arguments in my speech. Firstly, on how introducing a sugar tax is going to greatly decrease obesity rates in the country, since a higher cost will lead to fewer people buying these products. And my second argument is going to be on how alternatives to sugar are going to be created, because sugar is going to be very expensive for these companies, and so they're going to move to a healthier alternative. So something along those lines. You haven't really gone in depth into either of those points, but at the same time, you've laid them out in sufficient detail so that the judge understands what's going to happen in the rest of your speech. Okay, I hope that makes sense. The second topic here is rebuttal. So this might not be a term you've come up with previously as well, but overall, it just means saying that the opposition is wrong, or trying to say that their arguments are quite weak overall. So, of course, in a debate, proposition and opposition, the two sides, are going to alternate in their speeches. And so, quite often, you've just heard something that goes against your side of the debate, right? So if you've heard someone say that sugar taxes are going to be a bad thing with a very specific argument, then when it's your turn to speak, you might give a reason as to why something they said was false, why it's not actually that important. There are lots of ways in which you can rebut another person, and we'll have another lecture on that later in the week. But overall, you're just trying to give any reason as to why what they said, the judge shouldn't really think of it as that important or shouldn't take into account. And this can be around a minute, it could be more. Of course, it's all relative to the overall duration of your speech. It's so just make it proportional to a like 1 minute compared to a 5 minute speech, kind of. And then finally, the third topic of your speech is going to be the substantive. And what this means is the main arguments of your speech, the real like chunky content, which really gets your point across as to why your side of the motion is right. I think this is what we mainly practiced yesterday. You might have done some rebuttal, but the main focus was on this argumentation. So all of the arguments we were trying to just think up of oh why people's like obesity would go down if you have a sugar tax, how an alternative might be created. These are all substantive arguments which you bring out in this last section of your speech. And you should be spending the majority of your time on your main arguments. Okay. Uh, does anyone have any questions? I'll just wait for maybe 5 or 10 seconds.
So are these, parts of the speech, are they usually given in that order?
Very good question. So, generally speaking, yes. It's quite clear why you want to have your like signposting or kind of summary at the start of your speech, since that gives a layout of the rest. But rebuttal specifically, although it's okay to have it at the end of your speech, the majority of debaters would put it before they give their main arguments. And it makes sense logically as well, considering from a judge's perspective, they've just heard the other side, like the other debater speak, and so they have it in their head, right? And so if you're able to start your speech off with directly proving why that's wrong, that's quite like powerful, it's quite impactful. And in terms of you as a speaker yourself, this I think is the best way to structure your speech in your head. It's usually the simplest way, and the most organized way to do it. So I would suggest following this kind of order if you can. Cool. So moving on, this is the speaking order. So as I've mentioned previously, there are 8 speakers. So you can see uh, the top left here, these 2 people, Prime Minister, Deputy Prime Minister, are on a team together. Then opposite them, Leader of Opposition, Deputy Leader of Opposition are on a team together. And then similarly, bottom left is a team, bottom right is a team. They're all pairs of 2. And in terms of proposition and opposition, it's quite simple. Uh, it's just a case of alternating speeches. So one speaker from the side that's saying the motion is a good thing gives a speech, and then one person from the side of the motion is a bad thing gives a speech, and you just alternate in a very straightforward fashion. Uh, so I guess to to relate this back to the previous slide of the what you're doing within a speech, if we consider the fourth speaker here, the deputy leader of opposition, in their speech, they'll have 3 things. Firstly, their introduction, then their rebuttal is quite key here. In their rebuttal, they'll be rebutting both what the prime minister has said and what the deputy prime minister has said. So there are 2 proposition speakers which have gone before them, and so they need to be able to rebut the arguments that both of them have given. So, uh, intuitively, what this actually means is that as you go down the debate, there are more and more speakers who have already given their speeches, and so the amount of time you spend on rebuttal, which is proving the other people wrong, is going to increase. So, like someone like the prime minister, obviously they can't give any rebuttal since no one's spoken before them. Leader of opposition, they can give a bit. They have one person to rebut, but they as well don't actually have too much to rebut. And so they spend a very small amount of their time on that. But then someone like the deputy leader of opposition would spend a decent amount of their speech rebutting both the prime minister and deputy prime minister. So I hope that's relatively intuitive and it should make sense. Uh, so moving on, what we have next is something called a point of information, or it's very often shortened to a POI. So this, it can seem a bit complicated at first, and new debaters are quite shy in accepting them as well as especially actually giving points of information. So what a point of information actually is basically you interrupt someone in the middle of their speech and ask a question. Okay? And the way in which you interrupt is basically you just say POI, then the person who's speaking either says, yes, go on, or they say, not right now, sorry, something along those lines, accepting or rejecting your question. If they accept, then you can ask a question which lasts up to 15 seconds. So a relatively brief interruption. You don't want to be wasting the speaker's time. So make sure you're not like hesitating when you ask your question or you don't know what your question exactly is. Make sure before you interrupt them, you have a very clear like question in your mind, which you can quickly blurt out, and then they can continue on with their speech. So why are POIs important? So, I mean, if you just have 5 minute blocks of one person, then another person, and so on, then it's not very dynamic. You aren't interacting with other speakers as much as we would like. So it's quite important for a greater amount of engagement within the debate. This leads to more rebuttal. It leads to a like greater amount of logical thinking having to be displayed, and it goes both ways. So from a judge's perspective, if someone asks a POI, that's usually seen as a good thing. It shows that they're engaging in the debate and that they're willing to ask POIs, and it goes the other way as well. From a speaker's perspective, uh, if you don't accept any POIs, then it seems like maybe your arguments are quite weak and that if someone interrupted you and asked you a question about them, you would not have the capacity to answer properly. So you need to show that your arguments are strong enough that no matter what the opposition tries to interrupt you with, you're able to respond to it in an orderly fashion. And so the general rule of thumb of how many POIs you should take in your speech is usually one or two. So taking zero is usually a bad idea, especially if like someone asked you a POI and then you rejected it. Like obviously, if no one asks, then like you can't really do anything about it. You'll end up taking zero POIs and it's not your fault. But you should make sure you take at least one POI within your speech and you should not take three or more. Usually, if you're taking three POIs, what that means is that you don't have enough to say in your speech and you're trying to fill up time by having like other people speak during your 5 minutes or just getting like something else to say by responding to the questions they've asked. So one or two is the right amount. And uh, as a final like message, in this summer camp, realistically, the majority of people are not going to be reaching 5 minute speeches. What that means is that there's going to be time at the end of your speech where you don't have much to say, but you could take a POI. The reason why I say this is that the most likely scenario is that a lot of people don't ask many POIs and a lot of people don't take many POIs. So overall, I want to encourage more POIs. So considering how you definitely have the time to do them, to take these POIs and to give these POIs, please do that as much as possible. Um, okay, cool. Any questions on POIs? I'll wait 5 or 10 seconds because this can be a bit like confusing.
Um, I have a question. Let's say somebody asks you POI and then you reject it. Then can you, in the end of your discussion, just ask that you had a question? Can you ask me or something?
So the speaker is allowed to say that. So they're allowed to say, could you ask the POI you had previously? Or even if no one asks a POI, you can go like you can be proactive and just say, does anyone have any POIs? I'll wait for 10 seconds. Then or like wait for 5 seconds, something along those lines. You don't want to waste too much time on it, of course. And then if someone has any POIs, you're basically encouraging them to take one or like to ask one. And also that strategy shows to the judge that you are engaging with others and that you want to take a POI. The last thing is um, so first thing I didn't mention is POIs can only be given and taken between minutes 1 and 4. So what that means is that the first minute of someone's speech, there are no POIs, and then the last minute, so i.e. from minute 4 to 5, there are no POIs. So there's a span of 3 minutes where POIs are allowed. And then just the last thing to answer your question, if that's what your question was like trying to get at, after your speech is over, you can't like ask more POIs. It's not really a like, oh, my speech is over, but like I'd like to answer that question anyway kind of thing. It's like a very real part of the debate. And so it can only happen within that time period. Uh, Finally, even if your POI is rejected, you are allowed to ask again. So you can ask POI, the speaker rejects it. Then to be respectful, you're meant to wait around 15 seconds, maybe like 20 seconds or more. And then you just go again, you ask POI, and then maybe this time around they are more willing to accept. Okay? I hope that answers your question. Okay. Stefano, do you go ahead?
So just first, in the time that it takes for someone to ask a POI, does that take away from the speaker's time? And then in the time it takes for the speaker to respond to the POI, does that also take away from the time?
Yeah, so very good question. It does take away from your time. So the timer never stops from your first word to when your speech ends. All of that is needs to be within the 5 minutes, 15 seconds, basically. So when they're asking their POI, that's why it's a maximum of 15 seconds. you shouldn't be like wasting the speaker's time too much, and your response also is part of the time. Cool. So moving on to speaker roles. So PM, this is the first speaker. What they need to do is create a framework for the debate and define the motion. So sometimes the motion is not very clear. And so the first speaker needs to really lay out what the debate is about, what the motion is really trying to get at. Then they introduce policies and something called a model. Uh, I'll go more into that. And lastly, they introduced the government case. What that means is just giving like one or two really strong arguments for why the motion is a good thing. So when we talk about a model or framework, any of those terms, what that usually means is giving the specifics of the motion. So in the case of the sugar tax, of like this house would impose a sugar tax, usually it's something along the lines of, okay, we would have a set tax based on the amount of sugar in a product, and it's just very clear cut. But for example, in things like this house would legalize all drugs, uh, you need to really make sure you talk about how they're legalized, like who's selling them, really paint a picture of the world of like, okay, is it the government who's mainly selling these drugs now, or who is it going to be? So things like that. If you're able to really clarify, then everyone else in the debate, the other seven speakers, know what they're debating about, really. Otherwise, if you don't make it very clear, then it's quite often occurs that there are two different teams which have a very different image of the debate in their head. And so they're kind of just debating against each other without understanding the other side very well. Then the leader of opposition, this is the first speaker on the opposition side, so second speaker overall. They can do something called introducing a counter model. In the majority of debates, this is not necessary, but it might be necessary in certain cases. I'll also go into this later in a few slides. Then they rebut the prime minister. I've talked about this already. And then they introduce the opposition case. That's also quite self-explanatory. They just give their biggest arguments. Then moving on to speakers 3 and 4, they have very, very similar jobs. They do rebuttal based on how many speakers have gone before them. They rebuild what their partner has said. So their partner has already spoken, and then there's another person from the opposition team who has tried to take down your partner's case. And so you need to re-explain why what your partner said is still true, is still important, and is still a very strong point in the debate. Finally, you make new arguments where your partner has not touched on them at all. You are allowed to do this, bring out something completely new. And then finally, considering how you are the last speaker within your team, right? Since it's pairs of two, there are only two people in a team. At the end of your speech, that's when you're in some senses out of the debate. You have no more speaking time, at least to a large extent. So you want to finish off your speech by explaining why your team is currently winning. And there are lots of ways which you can do this. We'll explain that in other lectures as well. But overall, you just want to say, this is what my team has brought to the debate. This is what the other team has brought to the debate. Overall, these are the reasons why we win and why our points are stronger. Okay. Then finally, on the left, that's speakers 5 and 6. They do something called providing an extension. I'll go into that in the next. They're the last two speakers of the entire debate. 6 or 7 people have gone before them. And so what they want to do is finish off the debate by saying why their team won. So you're summarizing the debate, but you're also doing it in a biased way to explain to the judge, oh, this is why our team comes out on top, why we get first place instead of fourth place, and things along those lines. You want to be really explaining why what your partner said is the most important thing in the debate and why their argument has won the debate. Next thing you do rebuttal, very similar to how every speaker does some rebuttal, but often the last speakers have a lot of rebuttal to do just because of how many speakers have gone before them. Thirdly, you do weighing against the opening. This is a bit complicated, but in essence, you have to think back to how the debate has four teams. So not only, so your rebuttal mostly is against the opposition teams, right? The teams that are going against you, you can prove them wrong. You can say that their arguments are inaccurate, false, so on and so forth. But what about the team which is on the same side as you are? So as closing government, there is opening government, which spoke before you and spoke on the same side of the motion as you. So you want to explain why closing government is the team that should win and not opening government. What this looks like is not you saying their arguments are wrong, because that's quite like contradictory in most cases to your own case, but more that your arguments are more important. Maybe they affect more people, maybe they are just stronger because there are more reasons why you gave them to be true, or maybe you just point out something in the openings case which was a big like flaw which you filled in, that you like helped them complete their case, something along those lines. Finally, speakers 7 and 8 are not allowed to bring in new arguments, so their partners have to bring in any new arguments, and then they focus on things like summarizing, rebutting, things like that. And lastly, you explain why you're winning. I've gone over that. So moving on to the extension, this is what speakers 5 and 6 need to do. Actually, but I've spoken quite a lot. So before I go on to this, are there any questions? I'll wait 5 or 10 seconds.
When you're trying to weigh your like your own like opening, then is it okay if your opening can ask you a POI?
Okay, good question. No, you are only allowed to ask POIs to the other side of the debate. So you're not allowed to ask a POI to someone on the same side of the motion as you. So you can see how what this means is that opening government cannot respond to closing government in any way. There's nothing they can do. So in a way, closing government has a lot of power here, since they have they go afterwards and they have the entire debate in mind when they can explain why they win. And opening government can't really do anything about it. But you'll see overall it's still like a fair system. Cool. Moving on. So the 5th and 6th speakers, which are the first speakers of the closing teams, right? A new set of teams start debating after speaker 4, where like the first two teams have finished their speeches. What their job is to bring something new to the debate. After 4 speeches, a lot of things have already been said, and you don't want to be repeating things. And this can be quite a big problem in a lot of situations. So as the 5th speaker, you don't want to be repeating what your opening government team has already said. So to do this, you bring out a extension. This can look like 4 different things. Either a new argument. This is the most common approach. Bring out a new argument which hasn't been talked about before. You can also bring out new rebuttal. This is probably going to happen anyway. Rebuttal is quite common, but technically your rebuttal alone could win you the debate if it was very, very strong rebuttal. Thirdly, you can bring out new analysis. So what this actually means is that you're using the same argument which has been brought out before, but you're giving a whole host of new reasons why the argument is true. So in a sense, you're almost hijacking the argument, saying that you are the team which actually proves the argument to be true, and so the argument should be credited more to you than to your opening team, which likely said the argument in the first place. And then finally, fourth is you bring out a new stakeholder. What a stakeholder means is basically some group which is affected by the motion. So in some motions, it could be that the opening team has been talking a lot about students and how they are affected. As a closing team, you might bring out a new argument about par sorry, about parents or teachers, things along those lines, which maybe are completely new perspectives that no one else has talked about. So overall message is you bring out something new to the debate as a fifth or sixth speaker, and then your seventh and eighth speakers can explain why the new thing you brought is the most important thing in the debate, and that's why you should win. Okay. Finally, okay, not finally, sorry. Next thing is proposition fiat. There's a very small thing. What it basically means is the motion is always going to pass through government without any challenges. So on the sugar tax, what opposition cannot say is, oh, this would never get passed through government because it's like so ridiculous that we don't have to worry about it in the first place. So you assume that the sugar tax has been implemented already, and then you consider this new world where there's a sugar tax and you discuss whether it's a good world or a bad world. You don't talk about like things like governmental policies of whether they would allow this to happen or not. You just assume that it happens. But you do not assume that everyone is happy with the decision. So things like the public being angry that this motion has been passed, that is a possibility. Things like backlash, all of that is something you are allowed to say. So yeah, the motion is allowed to get passed through, but not everyone has to be happy. Counterpropping, I won't spend too much time on this because it rarely happens. But what this basically means is the government team gives their model, and then the opposition team is allowed to do counterpropping and say that maybe the government's model is somewhat unreasonable, or maybe it's like not that fair for the opposition side. And so they come out with a different view of the world, which is usually more favorable to them. And then they explain to the judge why what they've said as this like counter model is more reasonable and should be believed instead of the model. I think that's all I'll say for now. It's not too important. Okay, the last thing is about types of motions. So the first one, the first type, the most common, is this house would motions. So that looks like this house would implement a sugar tax. Uh, in this case, you're adding something, there's like a policy you're implementing, and you're like adding something new to the world. And there are like specifics that need to be ironed out by the proposition side of how exactly this sugar tax is implemented. Usually you want to talk about the problem you're addressing. So maybe in this case, it could be obesity and you're trying to reduce obesity. And then you want to talk about how your side solves this problem, and specifically how the model of a sugar tax is going to work to solve obesity. And then opposition basically just points out the harms of this policy, so why a sugar tax is going to lead to bad consequences. So that's the first type of motion, and then there's the last slide. These are the other types of motions. You can group together the first three as like being quite similar. So these are this house believes that, this house supports, and this house prefers. They're all very similar, and it basically means you're considering a different world, and you just want to discuss whether this new world is better or worse than the current world in most cases. So the key difference compared to a this house would motion is that there is no policy. So you don't discuss what the sugar tax looks like. You're more just given this world. You're described the world in its like entirety, and so you only discuss whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. This will become more clear when you do one of these debates. Finally, this house regrets. What this means is that there is something in the current world, like maybe social media, and you're saying we regret that social media exists, something along those lines. And uh, you're trying to say that a alternate world without social media would be better than the current world, which has social media. The key difference here is that you're kind of looking more into the past. You're thinking about some point in time in the past where you diverged from the current world onto a world where social media was never invented. And so you have to explain what this new world looks like. It's not just a clear-cut case of there's no social media. You might have to explain what is replacing social media, what was invented in uh, instead of it. And so maybe the case is that instead of social media, something much worse is created, and that's why this alternate world is even worse. Something along those lines. Okay. It's this lecture has gone on for quite long. That's the end of it. Are there any questions?
So with the proposition fiat, does the opposition also have to assume that this policy will pass, or they're not doing that?
Yeah, so that's the main like situation. Opposition has to agree that the policy has already gone through. They can't argue that it would never go through. Yeah. Okay.
Does the prime minister do?
Sorry, could you say that a bit louder?
I haven't got like much of the prime minister and what he says.
Okay. So first of all, prime minister is the first speaker, right? And so what they do is they create the framework of the debate. They explain what the world looks like. So I guess for the sugar tax motion of like this house would implement a sugar tax, you want to explain um, things like the problem, so what you're solving for, right? There might be one main problem that you're trying to solve or multiple. Then you explain why a sugar tax is the best solution, why it's the only solution, things along those lines. You also explain what the sugar tax really is. You have to explain the specifics of it, maybe talk about how the government is the one implementing it, who is being taxed. Is it mainly like the people, the retailers that are buying the sugar from the farmers? Is that where the main tax is happening? So those kinds of like specific details. And then, but all of that, like that kind of technicalities is just like the start of your speech. The majority of your speech is quite straightforward. It's what every other speaker does. And that's just giving arguments. That's just giving reasons as to why a sugar tax is good and what would happen in a world where a sugar tax exists. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, cool.
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
So for the proposition fiat, can the opposition say like this goes against the Constitution or no?
No, you can't say it goes against the Constitution. But also, motions in general, like the Constitution is a very American concept, right? Uh, Motions in general are global. So, it's meant to, so when you're debating, you consider the motion to be implemented in every country. That's not unreasonable. So in most cases, democratic countries. Yeah. Okay.
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Like, how do we like write our speech? Like,
Yeah, so like logistically wise, you can either write on paper or you can type it out on like Word or Google Doc. To actually structure your speech, you want to be taking notes when the other speakers are speaking. So you want to write down what they say, and then you want to quickly write down your response to it right below it. Uh, And so when it comes to your speech, you'll look through that section, you look at all the responses, and you'll put that into the rebuttal section of your speech. Then during prep time, which is before the debate actually starts, so you have around 20 minutes then, that's when you're mainly focusing on your arguments. So you'll be discussing with your partner about what arguments you should run, and you'll write down the headlines of the arguments, you'll write down the reasons why the arguments are true, you'll write down the impacts of the arguments and like what are the like consequences of what you're saying. Um, does that answer your question? Do you have like, do you want to follow up on that?
Yeah, and when we like write the speech and stuff, will like the guidelines be there?
So as in
Like
like
on like the
these,
first slide?
sorry, which slide?
Yeah, those.
I I can send out this document like in the next 5 minutes, and then maybe you could look at it during prep time.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Anyone else, or else? Otherwise, we can start the.
I have a question.
Yeah. Yeah.
So do we get to choose our partners, or are we randomly selected to get a partner?
You'll be randomly put into pairs.
All right.
And last thing, try not to write out your speeches word by word. If possible, try doing more like bullet point style, because you don't have that much time to be like writing out the entire speech.